Hello and welcome to the third episode of Making a Killing, the podcast from Hudson Institute's Kleptocracy initiative on how corruption is reshaping global politics. I'm Nate Sibley, a research fellow at Hudson working on policies to counter authoritarian kleptocracy, and I'll be your guide on this journey into the darker corners of the global economy. If you're joining Making a Killing for the first time, I hope you'll check out our first two episodes with Marshall Billingsley, a senior former US Treasury official, and Daria Kaleniuk, who campaigns against corruption in Ukraine. They'll give you more background on kleptocracy and what kind of content you can expect going forward. Today, I'll be speaking to someone who certainly knows a thing or two about kleptocracy, and that is Mary Butler, who leads the US Department of Justice's Kleptocracy Asset Recovery Initiative. We'll be talking about how the US prosecutes corrupt foreign officials, targets their stolen assets, and tries to return them to the populations they were stolen from. It's an amazing insight into a little-known but increasingly important area of work, which I hope you'll enjoy as much as I did. And as always, we'll be hearing from investigative journalist Casey Michel and congressional policy advisor Paul Massaro about the latest news developments and policy ideas. As always, please subscribe and share with your friends. And of course, a 5-star rating on Apple Podcasts really helps to get the word around. Hope you enjoyed today's episode. And without further ado, let's hear from Mary over at the Department of Justice. Okay, well, I'm joined now by Mary Butler, who is Chief of the Money Laundering and Asset Recovery Section, also known as MLARS, within the US Department of Justice's Criminal Division. She also heads up the work of the interagency Kleptocracy Asset Recovery Initiative, also known as CARRY. So welcome to the show Making a Killing, Mary. It's great to have you. Can't think of anyone better to talk to about how exactly the US government goes after kleptocrats and their ill-gotten gains.
Well, thank you very much for the chance to be with you. I have been listening to your podcasts, and I'm pleased that you have a lot of listeners interested in this work, which obviously we think is extremely important.
No, couldn't agree more. So I guess to begin with, though, because not all our listeners may be familiar with what you do, perhaps you could tell us a bit more about your work at MLARS and CARRY in particular. So why was CARRY created back in 2010, I think it was, right? And how does it support broader US efforts to combat transnational corruption?
Sure. So the department's Kleptocracy Asset Recovery Initiative, we call it, is in the Money Laundering and Asset Recovery section of the Criminal Division at the Justice Department. And it's basically a team of prosecutors and financial investigators working with specialized criminal investigators to recover assets and prosecute people linked to foreign corruption that affects the US financial system. And then, importantly, to try to return those assets for the benefit of the people harmed by that corruption, but through the kind of transparent and accountable agreements that attempt to address the vulnerabilities that led to the corruption in the first instance. We have about 19 trial attorneys working on these matters, pretty much full time. And as I said, we work with criminal investigators, including the FBI's International Corruption Unit, Homeland Security Investigations, HSI, and IRS. And we often work with various US attorneys' offices and, of course, our colleagues in the fraud section, FCPA unit. The initiative was formally announced, as you said, in 2010 by Attorney General Eric Holder. And he, at that time, provided us with significantly more resources. But the reality is that the roots of our work actually go back much further. For many years, going back at least as far as the administration of President George W. Bush, there was an articulated US government commitment to denying safe haven in the United States for criminals and criminal proceeds. And so it included asset recovery linked to foreign corruption, as well as extradition and visa denials. And so leading up to 2010, there were some US attorneys' offices and some folks in MLARS who were doing some of this work. But I think over time, there was growing recognition that in order to really step up to our obligations under the UNCAC and also to a growing international imperative to deny safe haven, we really needed to dedicate some specialized resources to try to get the job done. And so we're grateful that that we got this big support and resources. At the same time as we got more trial attorney positions and budget support, the department provided support to enhance the budget of the FBI's international corruption units, which were forming at that time. And these are units of specialized agents working out of New York, Washington, Miami, and Los Angeles, focused on kleptocracy cases, FCPA enforcement, and antitrust work. And so this recognition that you really do need specialized people with specialized financial investigations training, and you need people who have the support to do complex investigations that take time, that don't generate a lot of quick results, was really an important recognition and a reason for the formal creation of the CARI.
That's great. So we're celebrating really this year then 10 years of CARI. So happy birthday to CARI and everyone on your team.
We have lots of potential dates to celebrate. We have the announcement date, the asset delivery date. We had some bigger plans before COVID about trying to raise awareness around the work we're trying to do and the problem we're trying to address. But we're celebrating belatedly. That's okay.
Well, I think many people are, so hopefully this will be the year. But so in that sort of vein then, I wonder if you could talk about some of your team's notable cases and achievements over the past 10 years. I guess many people, if you're listening to a podcast on kleptocracy, you may well have heard of the 1MDB case from Malaysia, for example. And if you could, I have a feeling you're going to say it's more complicated than that. But could you give us a sense of how much money the DOJ has managed to seize from kleptocrats under the program?
Sure. Well, let me take it first from a little bit about how we do what we do, and then I'll boast a little bit. Our cases usually have more documents than witnesses. And we have as many financial records as emails or other electronic evidence. So our cases can take a while because often the evidence is not within the United States. And even if we identify the assets in the United States or moving through the US financial system. So that is a big component of our work. We rely heavily on civil, judicial asset forfeiture, because we are often finding ourselves in situations where in the course of our criminal investigation, we need to lock down assets before they are dissipated, and then ask to stay those cases and continue with the criminal investigation, or we need to come to the realization that the situation has changed, or that some of our subjects will actually not be brought before US courts to prosecute and criminally forfeit because they are practically or legally immune from arrest and extradition. And so in that instance, we really lean forward on our ability to recover assets linked to foreign corruption by charging the asset. And that's why in some of our cases, we've kind of become famous because we have these charges which are US versus Wolf of Wall Street, or US versus one crystal spangled glove worn by Michael Jackson in the Bad Tour, or US versus a bombardier jet with a certain tail number. With that explanation, first, maybe I'll talk a little bit about the numbers and then some specific cases. With the caveat that the numbers probably don't always tell the whole impact, the whole story of our impact. Since 2010, we have recovered or assisted in recovering assets involving over $1.9 billion involving 11 countries. And we say recovered or assisted in recovering because sometimes when our investigators and we start looking into things, we see voluntary returns. And we count that as in the win column for us, that through a lot less effort, dirty money's leaving the United States and going where it should. We have returned or assisted in returning about $1.6 billion to 7 countries and jurisdictions. And we currently have about $1.9 billion in assets restrained by courts in pending litigation involving 10 countries. We also, although we started actually bringing criminal cases a little bit later on because we needed to be sure we had the prosecution skills hired into the Kleptocracy initiative. But since 2015, we've obtained 12 convictions through plea agreements already accepted by courts, plus one corporate plea. And we have charges pending against 17 individuals and one corporation. But many of our criminal actions are sealed at the moment for various reasons. So I guess that's the teaser. Stay tuned. I think in the next few months, you're going to be able to read about some more of the interesting work that's been going on over a couple of years. But
it's tantalizing.
Yeah.
I look forward to that.
I mean, it'll be good work. I think you're going to see some huge blows at international money laundering around the world. But it's easy for me to be excited about the work because I'm living it. But I think you will also be interested to read. We also enforce foreign court orders. And this is, I think, probably more important to people outside the United States listening. But one of the Financial Action Task Force recommendations is to have the ability to enforce foreign court orders if they meet your country's due process standards. And this is really the most efficient way possible for us to get dirty money out of the United States and back to where it belongs. And so, for example, we have $40 million in Marcos-related corruption proceeds that we were asked to enforce a forfeiture order against a little while ago, and we're doing that. And we have some smaller amounts for Ukraine, the UK, Canada, Brazil, and others. And we do that within MLAR's international unit as well. But now, just to tell some stories about some of our filed cases that you may have heard about. It's likely that the case that's gotten the most press and public attention is our case to recover funds embezzled from the Malaysian Sovereign Wealth Fund, the 1MDB. This case involved embezzlement of about $1 billion in loan proceeds and about $3 billion in the proceeds of bond offerings. Although the scheme is much larger, more than $1.6 billion of that money stolen was invested in the United States or moved through our financial system. And our team has recovered to date about $1.2 billion in assets linked to that scheme. And we have returned or assisted in returning to Malaysia about $630 million so far. But the reason, of course, the case is important for many reasons. Importantly, it demonstrates how if you get lucky and you work hard, these cases can come together quickly, more quickly than you might expect. Most of the civil forfeiture cases were filed in 2016 after only about a year of investigation. And then they were stayed while the criminal investigation continued. And then in August 2019, we were able to secure the guilty plea of a senior banker from Goldman Sachs who had participated in the scheme, and then bring more criminal charges. Importantly, what happened in that case is that other foreign partners like the Swiss, Singapore, and at least initially Malaysia had their own parallel investigations. And that really sped up the ability to share evidence and to get to the bottom of what had actually happened. I think one of the great ironies of that case is that while the scheme of stealing and laundering some of the funds was going on, they were being used to produce The Wolf of Wall Street, which of course is about a significant fraudster and his prosecution.
You couldn't write this stuff, could you? You couldn't write it. Yeah.
That's right. Yeah. Many years ago in my career, a really fabulous FBI agent told me, Mary, we're really probably only going to catch the sloppy and the not very smart. And so sometimes we have to stop from patting ourselves on the back too hard because crooks make mistakes and we are often able to capitalize on them if we are working hard and lucky. And this is surely an example of that. And, you probably were observing that during the course of our investigation, there was a presidential election in Malaysia. And so as we were exposing the corruption that led to our work, the voters of Malaysia were weighing that in their election decisions. And so it had a kind of a snowball's effect, I guess, on addressing allegations of corruption in that country. And I don't think that will happen.
It was amazing, isn't it? Yeah. Because that's like the tagline of this podcast is how corruption is reshaping global politics. And in that case, it was your actions and those of your law enforcement partners around the world that actually reshaped the course of an election, really, was sadly a rare example of democratic pushback by voters against increasingly corrupt regime.
Right, in a very hands-off way, because we were exposing information. So that's how democracy should work. Mm-hmm. So yeah, that was really affirming about our work. And I think to just tag along with one of the things you were saying, one of the things that we think is happening as a result of our work is when we're successful and when we can return money in a way that demonstrates that the rule of law works, then our law enforcement relationships are really strengthened across all interests when it comes to extradition, counterterrorism, intelligence, money laundering. And so it's just a compounding collateral benefit, I think, of the work we do and of the importance of, the international focus and international attention to the problem. But to take you back to a couple of more of our illustrious cases, of course, we brought this civil forfeiture case against assets of the second vice president of Equatorial Guinea, Teodoro Obiang, and we restrained and ultimately obtained through settlement the proceeds of the sale of a Malibu mansion, a bunch of Ferraris, and Michael Jackson paraphernalia. And we recovered about $30 million. We're having some challenges.
Including the famous glove, right? The diamond encrusted glove, right?
That's right. And actually, I think there was also a jacket worn on a tour. Sometimes kleptocrats have expensive hobbies, and sometimes sometimes we get evidence in order to trace to those hobbies, and that's always good. We recently returned to Nigeria in an agreement that we entered into in February of 2020, $318 million of the funds we recovered, which had been embezzled by the former dictator Sani Abacha. Other countries in the world also recovered money from Abacha and are working their way through that process. The Swiss were one of the countries where they've already returned significant amounts. But to us, this is a significant milestone because we have worked on this project for a long time, and we understand the need to get that money back in a way that demonstrates that we returned it through the rule of law. We've recently filed civil forfeiture complaints against assets that we allege are linked to a $5.5 billion bank fraud and money laundering scheme by politically powerful oligarchs in Ukraine. And the Ukrainian NABU, the specialized anti-corruption investigators, have a parallel case, but amount of money that has roughly run through the United States that we've seized, restrained to this point is about 60 million, but our work obviously is continuing. But in addition to these multi-million, billion-dollar cases, we also take on some smaller cases where we think that they will have high impact. So, for example, we have filed cases against assets linked to corruption in cases involving only a few $1 million, but our assets we could identify linked to the former president of the Gambia. We also recovered some assets for Honduras, where Honduras was conducting maybe one of its first really significant corruption cases. And we, of course, want to be supportive of countries who are trying to do this work. And we've also got money that we're trying to forfeit for the Philippines that relates to a kickback scheme involving their legislature and executive branch, which is probably their biggest corruption scheme exposed since Marcos. So while we're looking for impact in terms of dollars that have moved through the financial system in the United States, we're also looking for impact in terms of supporting our foreign partners who are trying to fight the good fight as well.
That's great. I wonder if you could talk us, you've mentioned a few of these already, but I wonder if you could expand a bit on some of the main obstacles you face in bringing kleptocrats to justice and in returning the ill-gotten gains to the countries of origin. You mentioned the 300 odd million that you've recently returned to Nigeria. Well, lots of our listeners might think, well, Nigeria is not exactly a country known for kind of rule of law. Is it safe to return this money to Nigeria in this way, or will it simply be stolen again, given the high level of corruption risks there? So how do you work around those sorts of tricky problems?
So I'll start with returns and then move back to the recovery challenge. We don't have a one-size-fits-all policy for returns. We try to take into account what we think are the corruption risks. Is it embezzlement? Is it bribery? Are there sufficient budget and transparency requirements where civil society could play a role in trying to ensure the transparent and accountable use? How much money are we talking about? Because sometimes it's more important to return it and try to announce that and celebrate that than to spend significant amounts of time if we're talking about less than $1 million or maybe $1 million, even though that may be impactful in some countries. So no one size fits all type of formula, but focusing on Nigeria, for example, we've issued press releases, so this is all public. The agreement is available actually on our website. We wanted to address the problem of embezzlement in Nigeria, since that was the source of the ill-gotten funds. But Nigeria, expressing its own concerns about its own sovereignty, said, actually, we want to use this to build roads and bridges. And we already have a program in place where we're doing this, and we want to add this money to that project. And we think that you in the United States will appreciate that the highway system led to the development of the middle class in the United States. And so you ought to embrace this project. And construction presents huge potential corruption risks. So a lot of work was spent identifying who were the contractors who already had been retained, what were the safeguards in place for outside auditing of the work performed and the payments made. It turns out that Nigeria has a sovereign wealth fund that is pretty highly regarded by its peers and others. And they are the primary agency operating the project. And so we built into the agreement safeguards about auditing and about reporting, and also the financial support for a competitively selected civil society group to monitor the project. So the agreement is lengthy, and there are lots and lots of details to try to ensure that the money is used for the purpose that we all agreed. That agreement was entered into between us, Nigeria, and the bailiwick of Jersey, because that's where the money was sitting when we got a U.S. seizure order and enforced it against the bank account in Jersey. So on that one, because the amount of money and the risks, a lot of care was taken to ensure as reasonably as possible transparency and accountability. On the other hand, we have returned small amounts, like a little over $1 million to South Korea, to Taiwan, in circumstances where we understand that embezzlement is not their corruption risk, and where we wanted to get the money back to them. And in each case, they had actually done their own corruption prosecution and identified for us that assets were in the United States. And so that seemed to be the right solution there. We gave back a little over $4 million to Kyrgyzstan in the last couple of years under circumstances where Kyrgyzstan pledged to add that money to some existing EU programs that were intended to improve and strengthen the judicial system. And then also, I think, a clean water project. But our most famous return probably is through the Boda Foundation, where $115 million was returned to the people of Kazakhstan in a 3-country agreement involving the Swiss, the US, and the Kazakhstan government. We took the position that the $89 million, which grew over time to $115 million through interest, was intended to be used to pay bribes to high-ranking Kazakh officials. We were not inclined, neither were the Swiss, to simply return that money to the budget of the Kazakh government, and they agreed. And so we competitively created this foundation called the Boda Foundation, ran it through an international NGO with World Bank support, and we returned this money in a variety of ways, including in cash payments to some citizens who qualified under the program, but also in maternal and child health care and job skills training. So we've done a whole range of things. We're coming to the point in our program where we have more and more of our cases completed. So you'll see some more returns, I hope, in the next year. And again, we'll be using not a one-size-fits-all approach, but every attempt to ensure transparency and accountability, which is the international standard, and then to try to address the vulnerability that led to the corruption. There's always a tension in these negotiations of a country telling us, but it is our money and it is our sovereignty that you are trying to evade. And we try to emphasize that we understand those issues, but we are not going to be able to continue to do this work if we aren't able to ensure that when we return money, it's used accountably and transparently. And usually we can come to a meeting of the minds there. To talk a little bit about the challenges to recover assets, the tool that we have to use most often is money laundering. And not to be too technical, but money laundering requires basically 2 different elements of proof. One is a financial transaction that is within US jurisdiction. So within the United States, to bring money into the United States to buy something or to invest, or through our correspondent banking system. So that the financial transaction is usually the easiest part of the case, even with lax beneficial ownership in the past. Identifying the assets doesn't seem to be the hardest part. The hard part is you have to link that financial transaction to a crime. And for us, focused on foreign corruption, sometimes there's a crime committed in the United States in terms of a false statement to a bank or non-disclosure to someone that's required. But most of the time, we're looking at using the foreign offense provisions of our statute. So we're focused on foreign bank fraud, foreign bribery, foreign embezzlement. And the problem there is that the evidence is overseas. And that's a problem because sometimes when we are trying to get that evidence so that we can bring our criminal case or bring our civil forfeiture case, we need the foreign government to help us collect the evidence in a way that is lawful under their process so that it's admissible in our country. And, sometimes we're working in jurisdictions where there's not a lot of political will to help us. And there are also instances where in the middle of our case, the political commitment changes. And then there are cases where there's great will, but we're working with partners in countries where the criminal justice system has actually been used for the most part to gather enough evidence to extort people rather than to bring cases all the way through to trial and conviction. And so there's a willingness, but there's no experience or low experience. So we see all those challenges, and that may be why embezzlement is the easiest crime for us to prove, because it's mostly on the documents. But still, we have had some success. It's really exciting to see the bravery of some of our foreign colleagues who, can't be sure that the bad guys aren't coming back, or can't be sure that everybody within their own organization really is committed to the work that we're asking them to do. And nevertheless, they do it. And so it can be extremely rewarding in that way.
That's great. And we're coming to the end of our time now, actually, Mary. So I just wanted to really quickly finish off with a question. You've painted a pretty good picture of your work and how these international corruption schemes operate. But are there any sort of emerging trends, without giving anything away that you're looking at to the bad guys, of course? Are there any sort of emerging trends you see in your work, the way that kleptocrats are sort of operating that's different from maybe the past 10 years that Carrie's been doing this kind of thing?
Well, I guess one not so optimistic thing that we see happening is that we think that kleptocrats are starting to use more jurisdictions who don't or have not in the recent past cooperated internationally in providing records or other assistance. So that is troubling. But on the plus side, we see more countries actively addressing foreign money laundering in their countries, including, for example, Singapore, a new player in this field. And that's just great news. I think that we're going to see more cases opened up through some of the whistleblower and reward programs that are starting to be enacted. And not very many of our folks qualify under the SEC program, which is where there's significant funds. But there is some legislation for new ones. It will promote awareness about existing programs. And I think there will get people maybe financially incentivized to come forward with really critical information, but also people who might want to do the right thing, but know that they need money for the collateral consequences of their cooperation in terms of relocation and other security issues. So I think we'll see some more excitement along those lines.
Mary, that is great. Thank you so much. I'm very mindful that every minute you spend talking to me, you're not out there catching kleptocrats and other bad guys. So I'm gonna let you go now and get back to that important work. And I hope we can have you back again at some point in the future with more of those exciting updates that you sort of talked about earlier on. So thank you so much for your time.
Oh, you're very welcome. And on my return, maybe I can develop a little bit about what I think is the sort of whole of government approach to this problem that I think is both affecting prevention and enforcement. While I'm grateful for you to celebrate our results, I think there are plenty other actors in our government who deserve congratulation as well. So thank you.
No, great. And we'll be having some of them on as well to talk about their work. Welcome back, and I'm joined, as always, by investigative journalist Casey Michel and congressional policy advisor Paul Massaro to discuss some of the latest news and policy developments from the world of kleptocracy. Some good news to start off with. The National Security Council at the White House has appointed a dedicated director for anti-corruption efforts. Her name is Chandana Ravi, and she's a former Treasury official, and she joins a number of appointees at the White House with a strong interest in kleptocracy issues. So we welcome her to that role. Hope to have her on the podcast, of course, at some point, and we wish her all the best in those efforts. On to some of the news from this week. One case that sort of caught my eye that went a bit below the radar. A North Korean national was extradited to the US for the first time ever, apparently, from Malaysia in this case, to face charges of money laundering through the US financial system in order to procure luxury goods, presumably for North Korea's leadership, because of course there's no one else in the country capable of buying luxury goods. So that's definitely a case that will get more and more interesting as it proceeds through court. Moving over to Malta, Keith Schembri, who's a former prime ministerial aide, appeared in court charged with money laundering through a number of shell companies he owned as part of a huge corruption case that began back with the murder of investigative journalist Daphne Caruana Galizia in 2017. that is going to be the subject of a special episode of its own, because that is a huge, really important case in terms of understanding the transnational aspect of kleptocracy. And finally, just the other thing that just caught my eye today, the UK has confirmed that it will be adding the ability to sanction foreign officials for corruption, as well as human rights abuses, which currently exists under its global Magnitsky program. And I guess, Paul, that leads us to actually one of the biggest news stories generally this week, which was the sanctions imposed by the US, was it Canada, the EU, and the UK on Chinese officials over Xinjiang abuses, and in turn the sanctioning of various EU entities by the Chinese Communist Party. Not as strictly a corruption issue, perhaps, but you had some interesting thoughts on what this means for the sort of relationship between human rights and corruption sanctions. So I wonder if you could talk a bit about that.
Well, that's exactly right, Nate. And without a doubt, I mean, this is a huge news story and a huge development in sort of the development of the global alliance of democracy we've all been talking a lot about, in sort of expecting that the transatlantic alliance might be reinvigorated, that the EU, the UK, Canada, the United States might become closer under this administration, but also in opposition to the increasing authoritarianism within China. And it's a pretty extraordinary series of events, as you say, where it seemed like this is the first huge case of coordinated Magnitsky sanctions, just all at once, all together, really powerful, symbolically.
Which is magnificent. That's wonderful news, isn't it? That's something that everyone has been asking for, with the global Magnitsky program in the US. Yes, it's great, but it means more if people from other major financial centers follow.
That's exactly right, Nate. And it really is. I mean, it's one of these quiet, huge steps that this is exactly the way you're supposed to use these sanctions. If there is a single democracy that does not have these sanctions and not using them, they become a haven for dirty money and kleptocratic influence. So it really is an extraordinary thing. And of course, there are other countries that are considering adoption of global Magnitsky sanctions, including Japan, Australia, Taiwan. And I mean, if you get those countries to join in on this, you really are talking about a huge block of democracies that are able to block kleptocrats from abusing their system. So it's an amazing thing. To make it even more extraordinary, the response to this from China was to sanction essentially the entire political committee of the European Parliament, including one particular German Green parliamentarian, Butler, who is an outspoken critic of human rights abuse and corruption in China. And it just seems like this incredible moment where the Chinese Communist Party is pushing together democratic forces and kind of demonstrating why you can't have these sustainable rule of law agreements with a country, with a government, with a party state that does not act in a rule of law way, that acts in sort of an arbitrary and capricious manner. I'll note here, because you'd mentioned the UK corruption sanctions incoming. I mean, we want to see this kind of stuff under corruption as well, right? In this particular case, it was for human rights abuse. In corruption, it could be doubly effective because in the corruption case, these individuals are likely traveling to all of these areas, right? So, I mean, if you hit a kleptocrat in the USA, Canada, the UK, the EU, and then Australia and Japan, I mean, it's like, what are you going to do with your stolen money? Like the only choice you have left is to leave it in the country where it could be stolen by the next bigger thief, where it can be pointed out by activists, where civil society sort of knows where it is. And that's exactly what we want, So the corruption piece of this, if we could get coordinated global Magnitsky corruption sanctions, then we're really cooking with gas.
Well, Paul, if I could jump in, one of the things that we're talking about off mic is just how historic, how momentous, how in a certain sense unprecedented the developments in the last few days in terms of the West's broader unification on the specific decision is. Is there anything that comes to mind on your end that is even comparable that we've seen in the past few years as it pertains to that kind of unified front? Doesn't necessarily have to be on the Chinese side, but if there's anything that comes to mind, and if not, I mean, again, that highlights just how unprecedented this week has been.
And nothing comes to mind. Nothing comes to mind. I mean, this is the flag. This is what we've been waiting for. This is coordinated democratic action.
Even the Kremlin using chemical weapons on the streets of various European capitals, you would have thought would have elicited a unified response from those European capitals and the United States, and it didn't pan out, right? For various, various reasons at the time. But
coordinated sanctions by this sort of democratic group of countries, by this democratic alliance, is very, very different than a handful of countries ad hoc dismissing some diplomats, right? Which ended up being the immediate results of exactly what you're saying, Nate. And you would have thought Russian terrorist actions in a democratic country would have elicited greater results. But it is also like the winds are shifting. There's definitely a feeling in the air that this is the beginning. And then when you see the authoritarian states react like China has reacted, I would really believe that this is the beginning.
Means you're pressing a nerve, I guess, right? You know, if they react like that, you know it's working. It's rattled them. So I guess something else that caught my eye this week, Casey, I'm sure you saw, was that Catherine Belton, one of the foremost experts on Russian business and politics, a journalist, has been sued for defamation in the UK by the Russian oligarch Roman Abramovich over claims in her book Putin's People, which is excellent. I do recommend it. About his reasons for purchasing Chelsea Football Club, or Soccer Club, as this is a US podcast, back in the early 2000s. And this got me thinking about the role that the legal profession plays in transnational corruption, and particularly the sort of reputation laundering side of things. And then so I thought it was great and coincidental to see that pop up in my newsfeed was a great article you wrote along with Alex Cooley about this in Foreign Policy this week. So I wonder if you could just tell us a bit about what you were thinking about and some of the things you're advocating in that article.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Nate. And I will say, just to reiterate what you just said about Catherine's book, it's fantastic, highly recommended, and I don't think it's any coincidence that this lawsuit comes just a few weeks or a few months after Alexei Navalny posited Abramovich as one of the leading figures that the West should consider sanctioning as well. So the thrust of the piece that I put together with Alex Cooley, who's a professor at Columbia University's Harriman Institute, and I was fortunate enough to study under for graduate school, the thrust of the piece is that for too long, for too many years, and in far too many instances, far more instances than we could even catalog, U.S.-based lawyers have played a key, overlooked, and outsized role in what we have come to understand, what we have come to determine are these kinds of transnational money laundering, transnational reputation laundering, kleptocratic networks, kleptocratic individuals, kleptocratic regimes, and kleptocratic cases. As we write about in the piece, so much of this comes down to what we have termed as enabling, those figures in the West who act as the gatekeepers, as the enablers for these oligarchic figures, these regime figures that are, again, immiserating populations, brutalizing their people, looting national coffers, and then coming into Western polities and laundering their funds, purchasing real estate, setting up anonymous shell companies, and then creating these images of themselves as philanthropists, as businessmen, et cetera, et cetera. You think of any of the big major kleptocratic cases over the past few years, whether it was 1MDB out of Malaysia a few years ago, whether it was the case of Teodor and Obiang out of Equatorial Guinea a few years ago, there is almost always going to be a U.S. lawyer at the heart of it. And so much of that comes down to...
Thankfully, I have to just jump in quickly because we're coming off the back of the interview with Mary Butler, of course, where she was also a US lawyer at the heart of those things, and but on the other side of things, thankfully, we're very grateful to have her there. But sorry, I cut you off.
No, you're exactly right. Far be it from me to cast aspersions on all US lawyers. Again, it is not attacking each and every single American lawyer that there is. It is what we attempted to do with the piece is look at it from the vantage of how is it that these specific lawyers involved in these cases are able to do what they're able to do? How is it, as we saw with Obiang, that his American lawyer based out in California was able to set up the shell companies, was able to set up the meetings with the realtors, and was able time and again to go to bank after bank after bank with the explicit purpose of dodging internal anti-money laundering checks. And we know all this because of the great work from the Permanent Subcommittee on Investigations. Senator Levin and his staff unearthed all of this information. But how is it that they're able to do that? And the reason, as we detail in the piece, is simple. It's because there are no anti-money laundering regulations and requirements for U.S. lawyers. And this is despite the fact that the Financial Action Task Force, again, one of the primary rulemaking governing bodies as it pertains to anti-money laundering policies, has recommended time and again basic due diligence among lawyers when it pertains to them accepting funds from foreign sources, when it pertains to them setting up shell companies for their clients, when it pertains to them being involved in these high-end, high-level purchases for their clients. Now, we centered on U.S. lawyers because, as we found in our research, there is a very clear dividing line as it pertains to the transatlantic realities within the legal systems. That is to say, for U.S. and also for Canadian lawyers as well, though we don't talk about them in the piece, it is effectively open season. They can work with whoever they want, doing whatever they want, whichever clients they want, no matter the source of the income and no matter the reason that they may be setting up these shell companies, may be purchasing this real estate on behalf of clients, et cetera, et cetera. Whereas in the European Union, these recommendations from the Financial Action Task Force have been implemented time and again aggressively. And I just want to go back to the Obiang case for a moment because it was so clear. It's so obvious. The piece details it. The Senate documents detail it. This gentleman set up all these shell companies, opened all these bank accounts, was involved in all these high-end purchases. And we know all about this. And he didn't suffer a single bit of sanction. He didn't suffer any blowback whatsoever. And he continues to freely practice law in the state of California. And again, that's just one case that we know about and we've known about for over a decade. So that's the thrust of the piece.
Just sort of real quick say, I just walked out of the hearing on the Global Magnitsky Act held by the Tom Lantos Human Rights Commission, and Tutu Alicante was one of the, of course, of Equatorial Guinea Justice, EG Justice, has been working on these cases for a while, was there, testified, and recommended that the Global Magnitsky Act be used against enablers. And while you couldn't use this against, for example, U.S. enablers, because it can only be used on foreign persons, there's no reason you couldn't.
When we say enablers, we mean these professional intermediaries, the lawyers, the bankers, the accountants who service kleptocrats, right? Enablers is a term that we all use in the sort of anti-corruption community, but sometimes I think we have to sort of explain what
those enabling these kleptocratic figures and networks to access Western institutions. Right.
That's exactly right, Nate. And thanks for clarifying that. And I mean, in the lawyer's case, I mean, can you imagine a single law firm or a single lawyer, even a particularly egregious offender, being hit by global Magnitsky sanctions, and what a massive impact that could have on the enabling industry. I mean, it could, in a way, it would fundamentally deter this kind of behavior far more than even, kleptocratic behavior is deterred when kleptocrats are hit by global Magnitsky, because these individuals ostensibly operate within rule of law structures and want to be viewed as, by their peers and by others as these respectable individuals. And that's exactly why they get hired.
So an awkward question would be, the whole point of these lawyers and other enablers is that they are based in usually advanced democracies, financial centers like the UK, the EU, and the US. We were talking earlier about the importance of aligning sanctions and getting collegiate political will from democracies behind the growth of global Magnitsky sanctions. If one country started, if the US sanctioned a London law firm, or the UK sanctioned a New York law firm or a Berlin law firm or something, would that not tend to undermine that? Is this a step too far, and should we keep it directed primarily just at the kleptocrats themselves?
I mean, I will say, Nate, to that question, the recommendations that we go to in the piece are less about potential sanctions in the future, although, Paul, to your point, the flexibility of those sanctions regimes is absolutely one of their benefits and one of their advantages. And who knows what kind of conversations will emerge in the future as it pertains to those being slapped on potential enablers or enabling industries themselves. The recommendations that we look at are, again, specific to the American context, and that pertains simply to the aligning of the U.S. legal architecture, that is to say the anti-money laundering regulations, best practices, protocols, and policies, aligning those with what we already see taking place in the European Union, what we already see based upon the Financial Action Task Force's best recommendations. We're not asking for anything revolutionary. Sure. This is something that is already in place elsewhere, and that is past time for the U.S. to implement it as well.
Well, and two quick things. I think, first of all, I think you're absolutely right, Casey, and I think we need this. And in Congress, we've also been thinking long and hard about this. I'll say I'd be just a little careful with the EU's, because the EU just often puts things in place that don't get enforced. And I mean, in the UK context, I know that is the case. And I've talked with Transparency International UK, who have continued to complain about the fact that these things are in place and then do not get enforced. So there's kind of this, we don't want this to be a facade of accountability when in fact there is no accountability. I think we need it. The second thing is, Nate, to your point, is yes, I think that there are diplomatically savvy ways of doing this, like we did in Latvia, where we actually talked with the government of Latvia before sanctioning this Latvian oligarch. I think that you could potentially foresee a situation in which you're letting them know we're thinking about this. You're thinking about this. Are you going to take care of this? Are
Right.
you going to, before we do? I mean, there's just clever ways that you can go about this that keep the diplomatic pieces of it very, very good, on good terms.
Mm-hmm.
But I think we need to acknowledge that the enablers are a huge part of kleptocracy, or else we're going to be in a lot of trouble. So we
Right.
can't play nice over over the prioritizing the clamping down on the enablers.
Yeah, in many ways, they are the key figures. They are the key linchpins that allow these networks to operate, to expand, to entrench, and to infect these democratic polities. But Paul, to your point, you're exactly right. You can have as many regulations, as many laws, as many policies as you want. Without enforcement, it doesn't mean anything. So one of the things that we call for, increased enforcement of laws that are already on the books, especially as it pertains to those working in lobbying networks, whitewashing the images, the reputations, the backgrounds of these oligarchs, of these kleptocrats. Enforce the ones that are already in the book, expand things like the Banking Secrecy Act, expand basic anti-money laundering protocols, and then enforce it every single day, every single month, every single year, in every single instance.
Well, that is one of the the purposes of my project, which you're both so closely involved with over the years, is to get people off of this fixation on sanctions as an answer for everything, and to start to look at the nuts and bolts of how authoritarian kleptocracy is spreading around the world and infecting, well, even at the heart of our democratic societies now. But that's unfortunately about all we have time for again this week. So, gentlemen, thank you so much for your insights. As usual, there's plenty going on that we didn't get a chance to talk about, but I look forward to speaking with you again, and maybe we can catch up in between time. So thanks again. Bye, guys.
Thanks, Nate.
Well, that's all we have time for today, unfortunately. I hope you found this episode of Making a Killing as insightful and enjoyable as I did. If so, please don't forget to subscribe, share, and give a good review on Apple Podcasts. It really does help. So thanks for listening, and I look forward to welcoming you back next time for more on how kleptocrats and other criminals are literally making a killing.